And welcome back on our stage. Hello, Joke. It's a pleasure to welcome you on our virtual stage.
Thanks very much for having me.
So you work as a program developer in circularity in urban regions at the AMS Institute. Your primary aim is to advance the city circular economy, and to do this, you help translate scientific research into innovative solutions. Before joining AMS Institute, you worked as a researcher on inclusive urban planning and green jobs. You also worked on circular economy policy development at Circular Economy, where you have set up circular job initiatives devoted to promoting an inclusive and just circular economy. There's the question of being just and fair. A last intervention for today. Thank you for joining, Joke. You will be giving us the closing keynote. You will bring us beyond IT again to broaden our perspective, talk about shaping a better future for our society, circularity as a new model of economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, thanks so much for having me here and for that really wonderful introduction as well. I'm really here to indeed to bring the conversation back to beyond IT and kind of putting circular economy back in the bigger picture, and really what's the societal transition that we're going through. And so this is me going into sharing my screen. There we go. And if all goes well, then you can see this presentation right now, and fantastic. So as I said, kind of putting again, opening up our looks, our visions at the end of this incredibly interesting day that was kind of focused on IT. And so now we're going to talk about a new model of economy, which is kind of implicitly been present in every single discussion during the day, but really focusing on why are we doing what we're doing, and not necessarily just reducing our environmental footprint and looking at the environmental impact of our industry, of our economy. And I like to start with a couple of pictures to really see why it is that we're doing what we're doing and why it is acutely relevant. And so, as you can see, that next to the environmental issues that we're facing, next to the climate crisis that we're facing, there's also there's also a social crisis that we're facing, and that one is very, very broad. And of course, I'm not going to name the C word in this last session, but I think everybody knows what the picture on the left is referring towards, but really also kind of looking at the world of work, because as we want to go circular, we all have to ask ourselves, actually, how are we going to do that, both on a personal level, on an organizational level, and on a societal level? And there, the worker, the given of a worker, is an essential thing, and so that's why I added the second and the last picture. So the second and the fourth picture from the left is really, who are these people that are making this work? And so are we actually making sure that instead of only that environmental transition that we're going through, are we also doing this in a way that is societally justifiable? Are we actually creating something good for the people as well? And then, of course, the third picture from the left as well, I think everybody recognizes, is that the fact that we are standing in front of these crises, that we're facing them, is also very much recognized in the policy world. And the third picture is a picture of the new European Commission that has, of course, issued not only the Corona Recovery funds, which are directed at a greener, more inclusive economy, but also the famous or the infamous, I should say, EU Green Deal. And so, really, what I'd like to do is connecting those two challenges that we're facing. It's not only an environmental one, but it's definitely also a social one. So let's take a step back. And think about what constitutes circularity, what constitutes a circular economy. And then this is a fairly simplified image of what we see as the economy today, where we kind of start on the left with sourcing things. We kind of simplified way, we take them from the earth and then we process them into certain elements that we're able to put on the market, to sell and use. And at the end, we stop using them. And that's when a certain object or certain things kind of lose all of their value. And so in our current economic thinking, actually what happens after the use phase, doesn't matter, because economic value is what's built along all the way from the left to the right up until that use phase. And with the circular economy, again, in a very simplified way, what we're doing, or what we're saying, is actually what happens after the use phase is very relevant, because our resources are not finite, and us keeping using them in the way that we do does not remain without lasting impact on the environment and therefore on human life. So what we're saying is, actually, after using things, we need to keep them in use. We need to reuse them. And we don't only need to recycle them, which is the kind of the broadest circle that you can see on this screen, but actually we need to try to maintain as much value as we possibly can in order to kind of maintain the embedded footprint, the embedded impact of what we use as much as possible. So this is taking a step back. This is in a very simplified way what we want to achieve with a circular economy. And then once we try to project that on our actual economy, on our actual industry and society, we start seeing actually how much of a complex challenge this has become. We've talked about refurbishment, we've talked about reusing, we've talked about recycling, modular design, business models, etc. And so those are all the elements that will have to come in order to make this fairly simple diagram into a reality. And so what we like to do is looking at some of the core things that need to happen, and then some of the things that need to happen in order to support those core things from happening. And core things from happening are all about reuse, lifetime extension, and using renewable resources. So looking at the physical objects that move through our economy and making sure that they keep moving through that same economy for as long as possible. Now, this is kind of straightforward to organize on a small scale. It is far from the straightforward on a large scale. And so that's why we need those supporting elements in terms of collaboration, in terms of new business models that incentivize certain behavior, in terms of using design principles that will allow for us to reuse those objects. And then, of course, there's sharing knowledge, there's the smart use of digital technology. So those are really the strategies that we apply in order to make this circular economy happen. Now, in my introduction, I said that I was going to look more on the social side of things, and so that's what I'd like to do with this slide. And quite often what happens when we say we look at the social impact of the circular economy, what we actually mean is we're going to look at the employment effects of the circular economy. So there's many studies that have been done that look at actually how much jobs is the circular economy going to create. We've seen it in Belgium before, and Belgium is absolutely not alone in that. The mantra of jobs, 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 probably well known to the audience here. It's a very, very attractive argument for governments to sell, between brackets, the circular economy. And so we've seen that actually, on average, the transition to a more circular economy will result in an increase in jobs, will be a job creating transition. Now, that increase is sometimes overused. I do want to put that in its context. It's sometimes overused in the sense that this is not the transition that will create mass jobs. But what we can say is that it does have a positive net employment effect. That is very important. But it can also be used as a vehicle to kind of modernize the labor market and to make it healthier, to make it more interesting, and to make it more fulfilling for everyone active on it. But that's something that we'll dive into later. Firstly, if we want to dissect those numbers, that positive employment effect, a little bit more, then we can look at the graph on the right, and then we see that actually that small positive effect actually it hides quite a few of the underlying dynamics. So if we divide the economy up in the sectors that we usually do it in, so there's this graph, there's other ways of dividing up the economy as well, of course, but this is for a European study done. Then we see that actually some sectors have a lot to gain, but then other sectors have something to lose. So what we'll see is that despite the fairly small positive employment effect, there are actually massive transitions happening within the economy. So don't let the kind of this fairly limited overall number fool us, let's say, to think that this is going to be a small transition for the labor market. Now, those graphs are. This is macroeconomic thinking, right? So we're used to kind of dividing up our economy in sectors, and what I'd like to do today is maybe take another look at it, because I just said we are going to expect kind of big shifts on the labor market. So what could those look at? And this is a metaphor that I've used before, and what I try to do is step away a little bit from the sectors and looking a little bit more at the characteristics of what we're going to be doing. So working in the circular economy, how is that different from working in a linear economy? How is working in that straight line that we just saw different from working in that spiraling diagram that we saw? And what I can down to is actually there's three main differences. And I link them with three types of animals, with three types of insects. And I hope I'm not saying anything wrong here. I do hope they are all insects. But firstly, we're going to need to innovate. And those three insects that you see, that they're icons for fireflies. So there it's about how do we make things in a new way, so we can think about those design strategies that have been discussed earlier today, but also kind of coming up with those new business models, really the innovating and the creative brains behind that change that needs to happen. So those are the fireflies. And then we come with the ants. Another thing that's going to change in the world of work, or in the more circular labor market, is that transition needs to be not managed, but it needs to be implemented. We're going to need lots of hands and lots of feet to do that, because a circular system is inherently more complex than a linear system. We'll have not goods going through a kind of linear trip through the economy, but they'll go through a web in that economy. And so quite often we'll need logistics support, and logistics will become a lot more complex. So that's why I chose the ants there for a little icon. And then thirdly, we'll need to connect, we'll need to pollinate. And so those are the bees as a third type of insect that you can see. And the bees are really the intermediaries of that circular transition. So the people that can spread knowledge, that can connect to different networks, because we'll need to know where goods are coming from and where they're going to. So really the pollinating ones. So we have the fireflies that innovate, the ants that organize, and the bees that pollinate. Just as three types of change that are happening to our jobs as we move into a more circular world. I also wanted to maybe apply that on the sector that we've been discussing during this conference, on the IT sector. And so if we look at the manufacturing industry, so the first thing that you can see here is a gray circle, which is kind of like the, let's say, the traditional trip that a product or a good goes through. We go from extraction to production to use, and then throw it away. And then the colorful blobs that you may see on the screen, those are really different circular strategies that intervene in different parts of the value chain. So you can use products as a service on the bottom left, or you can repurpose laptops and things, and that goes from that covers everything from laptops and phones to servers and kind of larger scale installations as well. And what you see is that for all of those circular strategies, actually there's people that we need. We need material innovation specialists. We need material brokers. We're going to need disassembly operatives, right? And so those are all people working in a more circular economy. And so if we project our three types of insects on this value chain, then you'll see that also in the IT value chain, we're going to need those fireflies, those ants, and those bees to pollinate. So this is a little sidestep to the value chain of interest from today. what I'd like to share with you today are three, how shall we call it, three things to bear in mind when we're thinking about the social impact of a circular economy, and then more specifically zooming in on the world of work. And the first thought that I'd like to share with you is the connection between the circular economy and inclusivity, or an inclusive labor market. Because as you can see on this image, or what's missing on this image really is a geographical context, right? This is a purely hypothetical image, and what we see is that we're going to create jobs on certain places, but actually the type of strategy will have an impact on where those places are. So we might see that even though the net employment effect of a circular economy is positive, it might not be positive in every sector, but it might also not be positive in every region. So maybe certain regions will have to gain, certain areas, urban or rural, will have to gain, and other areas will have to lose. So thinking about both winners and losers of a circular economy. What we can say, though, and now I'm showing you back that first hypothetical diagram of what constitutes a more circular economy. What we can say is that because it's inherently more complex, we'll actually add all these types of intermediary processes or supporting processes. And if we break down a little bit what these processes are, and if you read through them what they are, then we can see that actually those are activities relating to the manufacturing industry that we can actually bring back. That we can actually bring back to these regions. And so this is a process that has been named reshoring. So a lot of jobs that have actually been pushed out of our Belgian and European market, kind of pulling them back in. And what that means is that we're going to redevelop a certain industry that has kind of the previous decades has slowly moved out of our markets, and we're going to reintroduce it. And that brings me to the second train of thought that I'd like to come to today, and that is the one of skills development. Because if we're reattracting this new industry back to our markets, that will mean that we'll also need to kind of develop the talent that is required with these activities. And one thing that's interesting to share about that is that a current dynamic that we see in the labor market, we see it in Belgium as well, is what we call the hollowing out of the labor market. And so that means that actually the mid-skilled jobs, so if we say we have low, mid, and high-skilled jobs, is that we're actually starting to lose the mid-skilled jobs. And those are the more the manual labor, but the craftsman labor. So that requires a certain level of technical ability. And because we're reintroducing those processes, because we're reintroducing those manufacturing-related activities into our own market, it is said that actually a transition to a circular economy could also counter that movement of hollowing out of the labor market, and again opening it up to a broader range of skills profiles. Now the question is, how can we actually realize that? Because we don't only need to create those employment opportunities, but we also need to make on the kind of the demand side, but we need to make sure that on the supply side, that we also develop the right talent. And so a term that comes up quite often is the T-shaped skills profile, and that means as much as having a certain set of broad transversal skills that can be applied in different contexts and in different activities, complemented by a set of specific skills that are specific to a functional area, discipline, or specialty. And what that means for talent development is that on the one hand, we're going to need a structural integration of circular skills across all education, across all training, and across all lifelong learning. And I used the word circular skills, and I clarified it on the slide as well. That is not necessarily a separate concept. It's very much related to the green and the digital transition as well. So bear in mind that when we're talking about the skills needs for a circular economy, it is actually useful to not pull that apart from the other big transitions that our society is going through. Now, one of the things that we know for sure in the circular transition is that we're not always sure what's going to happen. And that's why one of the most important transversal skills to equip our workers with is that of adaptive learning. The skill of acquiring new skills, that's adaptive learning, and that should be a consistent part of that upper layer of the T-shaped skills profile. Now, at the same time, something that happens, and especially with this audience coming from an IT and a tech background, you know very well that innovations, they ensue one another extremely fast. And our education system is not equipped to kind of keep up with that. So we'll need to find a way to innovate our education system that we can develop those specific skills, but in a timely manner. Now, changing curricula is a matter of years, but quite often a new technology ensues the previous one in much less time than that. So how actually can education stay up to date with the technological developments in the field? And then you can start thinking of hybrid learning spaces where indeed education is much more closely connected to the industry. And then another metaphor that I've indeed used before is then really looking at talent the way we look at a tree, for example. And then if we start, so I think we all know that the circles in this cross section of a tree, they represent the years, because they how shall I call it? The consistency of the wood changes based on the conditions that it's going through. So whether there's more or less light, more or less heat or warmth, and more or less humidity and water. And so that's what shows actually the season. So we'll see a difference between winter and summer in these tree barks. And what I'd like to kind of compare this with is that this could also be kind of the pathway that our talent goes through. That as the world and our environment changes, that also our skills palette will change, and will anticipate and adapt to the needs of the current state and the future state of that circular transition. And so that's when we come up with terms like flexible career paths and adaptive careers. And those are, again, terms that, if we think of it in a macroeconomic way, those are, again, very, very attractive terms. They are very good or very desirable on a societal level. But what we shouldn't lose out of sight is that actually, and there again, I'm referring to that first graph I showed, that there's maybe a small overall change, but that hides big underlying changes. That's the same thing that's here. We shouldn't kind of lose the personal story out of sight, because what can be desirable on a macroeconomic level is something that we need to carefully steer, carefully foster and support on a more individual level. And that brings me with the third and last train of thought that I wanted to share with you today, and that's the one of decent work. Because what may be desirable on a macroeconomic level can be quite challenging on a personal level. Think of your own career right now, and think of what would have to happen for you to start up in a completely different sector, or to start doing a new job, or to actually start focusing on a separate activity or a new activity that's rising up in your sector. And so that's why I want to bring the attention to decent work. That's about the individual experience as much as the collective experience of that transition to the circular economy. So what happened here is that we mapped out some of the opportunities and some of the risks that are associated with changing to a circular value chain. So here again, applying it to the IT sector, is central in the image. You can see again that linear economy, or the simplified representation of that linear economy. And then again, the same 3 circular strategies apply to that, but where they happen on the value chain. So we'll have a case of product service systems, so lease systems, repair and maintenance, but also a resale, so a second-hand service. And I think we're all very much aware that the current linear value chain brings about certain risks when it comes to social impact. We're all very much aware. Sometimes we don't like talking about it, but we're all very much aware of labor conditions that are connected to the IT supply chain, both upstream and downstream. So both in the mining of the metals that we need and in the assembly of the products that we use. We were talking about smartphones earlier. Think about the kind of the elements that are used in the smartphones, in the touch screens, in the batteries, etc. And where they are mined, we know that people are not working in humane conditions. But just as much downstream in, again, the waste management of those products. Now, what we shouldn't say is that the circular economy is an automatic solution for that. It could indeed, it carries potential for a positive societal impact, but we shouldn't only look at, again, the quantitative one or the quantitative side of impact, but also the qualitative one. And there things become quite there's other risks that could come to the front. For example, platform work. So the circular economy is typically associated with more atypical and irregular work, and so we'll need to make sure that our labor protection policy, or labor policy, and labor rights evolve along as the structure of our economy changes. Now that's just to say that circular economy in itself doesn't make any claims about equal opportunities or the distribution of power and wealth. What we can do is we can use it as a vehicle to indeed promote those things, but we'll need to do it in a very conscious way. Now, just now I mentioned also the individual experience, and there, one last thing that I wanted to highlight with regards to decent work is also how proud one can be of their job. These are 3 Vogue covers that kind of came out during the first lockdown, if I remember correctly, and this is actually the first time that there is a nurse and a supermarket worker and a train driver appearing on the cover of these Vogue magazines. And if you would have asked me 2 years ago if I would ever use a Vogue magazine in a presentation about the circular economy, I probably would have declared you mad, but here it is anyway. And what I want to say with that is that actually our perception of what constitutes valuable work is also something that needs to change. And these covers show that it's something that can actually change. So we can allow ourselves to question the way we think about certain jobs. And if we kind of translate that to the circular economy, and now I'm referring back to the very first picture that I showed you. Remember the man in black and white working at a conveyor belt? The very foundation of circular economy is reuse, repair, maintenance, and recycling. And quite typically, those are not high quality jobs. What we don't want to do if we transition to a more circular economy is just create a massive amount of low quality jobs. No, if we're saying that our waste is our resource, then we should also treat the workers in a similar way. This is an example of the city of Rotterdam, where they try to indeed rebrand that waste. So it says gold transport on the side of that truck, and that's really what it was. So can we shift can we shift the appearance that those jobs have and that those people have, and can they become high quality jobs that are well paid, but entail a certain craftsmanship, and that can also allow people to be proud of the work that they do. And so that's where I want to end. And so what I've done actually through this presentation is I followed a kind of an opposite direction as to the direction that I usually do. And this is also how Olivier and me first got talking. It's about that different order, because usually when I give a presentation, I start with a big idea, and I try to make it smaller and smaller and smaller. And with every step we make it smaller, every step we make it more concrete. And here we started with a big idea, made it very concrete, very fast. Remember the predictions of employment effects per sector. But throughout the presentation, what I wanted to do is zoom out again and again and again, and take a step back again and again and again, until we address the very value system with which we look at our economy and at our society. And so that's what I would like to end the presentation with, is really saying that we are all developing countries now, in the sense that circular economy is about environment and resources as much as it is about people. And none of us have completely figured out how to do that, but we should all figure it out, and we should work together in order to figure that out. And at this point, I'll stop sharing my screen and open up the room for a Q&A.
Thank you very much, Joke. I'll read directly what Delphine just wrote. It's a very powerful, inspiring speech. Thank you very much. Indeed, that's what I thought as well. For people like me, and probably a lot of the audience who spend the majority of their time to defend topics related to sustainability, we hear an awful lot of bad news all the time, and we kind of need that energy, this type of intervention to re-energize us, to remind us that there are solutions to many of the massive challenges that we are facing, if we decide to go collectively for it. And the fact that institutes like yours are looking for solutions is really a key to guide us, I think, because we just don't know where we need to go, I think, collectively. There was one point that I saw in the chat, a question about awareness. Before you can initiate a change, creating awareness is key. There was a question, what's your take on that matter? And I would add to that you've shown the impact of the Vogue magazine, the gold transport. How would you recommend that we foster awareness? Are there messages that are clearly counterproductive, and are the messages that are more effective from your experience and your research?
I want to be very careful with answering this question, because it's indeed a very good question, because we've also, the reason that raising awareness is important at this point is because some of you with an innovation background probably know the kind of the innovation curve, right? And so we've achieved a point in the circular transition where just the front runners and just the pioneers are not good enough anymore. And so it's not only a matter of looking at what technological innovation and advancement we can achieve, but also how do we achieve this on a large scale? And that's where things like policy, governance, behavior comes into place, and behavior not only of those pioneers, but of the larger audience. So that's the reason why it is so important now. At the same time, we're living in a time of increased polarization, of increased social tensions, and we're actually in dire need of a story, of a shared narrative that we can look at the future together. So those are two reasons why raising awareness is so important. The reason that I'm saying that I want to answer this question very carefully is because at the same time, those reasons can be abused. And so on the impact side of things, we know that we need to change. Also on the governmental side, well, we know that we need to change. But then because there is this new narrative that can give hope and that can actually get large groups of people and multiple different groups of people behind it, it can also be abused. And so there, just as much as we have greenwashing, I guess circular washing doesn't sound as sexy or as accurate as greenwashing does, but that is something that we have to look into. What I tried to stress in my presentation, and I think that's the main answer that I'd like to give to that question, is that circular transition, it's very tempting to make it a technical thing, a technocratic thing, but make it into that bigger story, make it into that societal transition, that human transition that we need to go through, because that's the only way of actually realizing it. Those are the things I just said, but that's also the only way of making sure that it happens in a way that is actually desirable and doesn't only steer to that one single KPI that we all have our eyes on, but actually on the broader image that we're trying to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Very, very detailed answer. There was a question this morning when the first topic was about mining and extraction and metals, minerals, etc. And someone asked if there were, like we have climato-septics, are there mino-septics? I would ask the same. Are there circular-septics?
I think there definitely are, and it's also healthy to have that in a society. I think all of us should keep an open mind, and most of all allow ourselves to be critical towards ourselves, allow ourselves to be in a vulnerable position. And we haven't arrived at a point yet where anyone has a model for a perfect economy or a model for a perfect society. So I would actually encourage there to be a movement that is skeptical. Skeptical is a different word. That is skeptical about the circular economy, because that encourages a healthy debate. At the same time, and again, here I am with my nuance, right? It's good to have the skeptical movement because that keeps us in the right track. It makes sure that we actually cover all the steps that we need to cover. And the moment that we steer into a direction where actually the only thing that we want to achieve is make sure that there's no resource depletion and reduce carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, then we'll have the social movements, and we've seen it. The Gilets jaunes, we've seen how there can be uprisings, how there can be social unrest and protest against a certain environmental movements, and that forces us to also bring in the social perspective in the circular transition. So I would encourage us there to be a movement that is skeptical, just as long as there is no, as the movement doesn't say nothing better than the current state is possible. That is one answer that is, in my view, unacceptable.
And one of the problems we see is that very often, like for fake news and all the different kind of movement of skepticism, there's you only need a few very active people and many bots, and that kind of information takes much more space on the social media than, I would say, I can't say the truth, but at least the scientific view, the common scientific view about the key actions that we need to take. That's really one of the problems that I see with the skepticism. It's the way it's overused by a few people. It's only a minority.
Yeah. And the messiness and the complexity of reality, just it doesn't fit in, what is it, 122 characters or 244? I don't know how many we have now, but it just doesn't fit. And so also encourage everyone to keep with that open mind, keep learning and keep learning about new perspectives. I may as well be missing perspectives, and I'd be very keen to learn about them to make sure that we keep moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Indeed, that's one of the things that we try today. We've gone through tons of different topics to try to bring different perspectives about the different issues. And for those who were not there earlier, we are working this whole week with the UC Louvain, so University Doctoral School on Sustainable IT, but they also looked at plenty of different aspects during the whole week. There will be replays of the key conferences on their YouTube channel, and I can only encourage all of you to have a look at their program and then have a look at the replay of the conferences that could be of interest to you. Before we close, there's one of the points that you mentioned, which is way broader than IT, of course. Again, you talked about the skills and the evolution of society, and there's really this question of creating place for people who are less skilled, so that they can move upwards. There's so many people who are trying to go to the top notch of technology, but as you mentioned, there's this gap, and we need to bring the people into this gap. That's the only way for our societies in Europe to continue to bring wealth to everyone, I think. That gap that you mentioned there is really a key. I wonder to what extent our governments are able to act on that. But I don't know if you've got specific?
Yeah, well, and for everybody to take responsibility in that, right? So that the circular transition be a shared one, not where industry waits for government and government waits for industry to take action. So it's we definitely need to set certain scopes and boundaries of responsibilities, but we're also going to need entrepreneurship from every single one of us to move in the right direction.
Yeah, that's not an easy one. Entrepreneurship is not something that everyone wants to do, and I can.
Another one to add to the transversal skills for everyone.
There was a question in the chat. What about cradle to cradle to avoid waste, or eco-designing from the start?
Well, very relevant and 100% part of the circular transition. I think cradle to cradle relates to design, the design part of the value chain, and then everything that relates to kind of end of use management. So everything with relation to collection, separation, recycling, but also towards higher value reuse. And so I think the circular economy as a school of thought is really continuation, builds on what we know from cradle to cradle, and tries to take an even bigger picture in mind, to also then question actually, how does cradle to cradle create economic value? What is economic value? And so that's where the whole the business models come into place, right? So I do think that cradle to cradle is an essential part, not necessarily it's also a predecessor, but at the same time an essential part of that circular economy.
We see that the governments are starting to try to push, and also Europe through various ways, etc. They are trying to start to push for more eco-design. Are there recommendations from your institute or from others that you see more effective or less? And for example, I don't know, taxation to help certain paths and avoid certain paths, or what are the key actions that governments can take, do you think?
Well, yeah, there's maybe on the hard regulation side of things. There's in order to stimulate, because an eco design directive is a piece of hard regulation. But in order to stimulate that, there's of course there's taxes and there's producer responsibility. So both a tax shift and EPR, extended producer responsibility, are kind of the harder instruments that can steer towards this. But increasingly, we're also hearing that knowing what circularity even means, and as we've known from today and from the rest of the week, that's not necessarily an easy question to answer, but knowing what circularity means helps a lot. And so that then comes down to having a shared narrative, a shared strategy. What is that dot on the horizon that we're working towards? And how does that then translate to my sector and to my job? So if we actually have people working in a product design department, not everyone is equipped with the right LCAs, with the right life cycle analyses and data on what the different options are. So if you want to make that very concrete as well, then it's also on a company level assessing what are the different choices that we have. Should we go for recycling? Should we go for reuse? Should we go for a combination of those things? Usually I also add the option of renewable materials, but considering that we're on an IT conference, this is maybe a rather limited option. Therefore, my knowledge is not, or my expertise is not specialized enough for that in this sector. But knowing what the impact is of these different options, and so for everyone on the floor to actually know within the scope of their responsibility how they could act properly, or how they should act properly, because there is a wish with a lot of people, but then what's actually the right thing to do, because there's so many paths towards circularity. So going from that big image shared dot on the horizon, agreeing that's where we're going, and then translating that down to your sector, to your job, to your activities and your tasks.
Yeah, in the case of IT, because of course it's a IT audience, or at least the people around IT in companies that we have today. One of the things that I saw is that actually there's a way to translate sustainable IT good practices and principles, etc., from a CSR strategy into objectives of the different teams. And for some of them, we know that a big chunk of the impact comes from the equipment themselves. So of course, for the people handling the equipment and managing the equipment, the objectives may be clearer from the start, also for the people purchasing equipment, etc., but also for the people creating software, as well as product managers, marketing, etc. All the guys who are, guys and girls, of course, who are defining what the software engineers will need to develop. Because IT does not decide on what will be developed. They can influence, but there's only so much that they can say. So everyone asking something to IT, they need to be made aware of the impact of what they are doing, including potentially the impact on equipment and therefore circularity. So the question of involving everyone and getting your type of intervention also in IT talks, I think is really important, and trying to enlarge the view that everyone understands that they've got something to do. There's always a chain linking everything back to the equipment.
And that's actually a really, really important cue to HR managers. So I'm not sure if there's management in the audience or if there's HR managers in the audience, but it's really about figuring out what circularity means for your different departments, and then effectively also translating that to different KPIs. Because if you're going to a leasing model, then your revenue from sales should not be your KPI anymore. Then it should be a service-related KPI. And so in that sense, for every department, translating that in those KPIs, because quite often the department itself knows better what circularity means for their department than maybe the management does. So in conversation with that department, what should then be the thing that you're striving towards? Because that's also something that's going to need to change on a company level.
Indeed, and probably evolving KPIs. And one of the things that I quite like are what we call balance scorecards. So a set of KPIs, because what you see is that when you start trying to influence one, most of the time you will decrease the others. So if you have all these weighted KPIs that you take together, you need to try to get the best out of everything. And then you start making, I think, better choices as long as the KPIs are well chosen. And as long as you revisit which KPI you use regularly, because it evolves. And as you say, your business model is maybe evolving, for example, to adapt from selling equipment to selling a service. And in this case, your KPIs need to follow regularly. But what you said for circularity is true for sustainability as a whole. I think that we have the possibility to detail for example, the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations, they can be detailed into objectives for top management, middle management, teams, individuals, depending on the type of job that each of us has. And I hope that someday it will really be a financial incentive for everyone to work in that direction. I just read, without the stick from government and the carrot, new business model, circularity can only be supported by CSR. Indeed, very true. That's everything needs to be acted together, from government to top management to teams, etc.
Yeah, but it's also, I guess, that the exchange that we just had the past minute shows that if on a management level you decide that you want to go in either one direction, more circular one way or the other, then make sure that you don't only knock on the CSR door, but make sure that you also knock on the HR door, because in the end it's all connected within the company to make it happen.
Indeed. For those listening, if you want to have ideas about how to translate, at least in IT, what we identified as sustainable development goals, for example, into objectives, don't hesitate to contact our association in Belgium, France, and Switzerland. Joke, thank you very, very much. I will finish this talk by a quick recap, because I think that we don't have any more questions directly for you. Thank you very much again, Joke.
Thanks for having me.
So let me share my screen for the last time today. The pleasure of technology. I chose the wrong button. I can't see what I'm doing anymore. 2 seconds, bear with me. There you go. Fortunately, it was not my holiday pictures that you suddenly saw on screen. Anyway, so this is the end of the afternoon talks that we've had. As you've seen, really completely different types of talks. We've talked about extractivism and mining this morning, data and its impact. We've talked about eco-design of IT solution. In the afternoon, we talked about inclusivity, accessibility, about IT for green, technical solutions for energy transition, sustainable IT strategy implementation in large organizations, the panel debate. I will very soon know, I guess, from my president of the board what he thought about that discussion, as he was part of it. Then we had the discussion about CSR and refurbishment of IT with Geoffroy. And then finally with Joe, now we talked about circularity. So a day full of information, great speakers. I'm really happy with what we've done today. I hope that you found it as interesting as I did. You probably will want to see again some of the presentations, so we will make sure that as much as possible of the replays will be made available. I hope that we didn't have any technical issue with the recording. I want to thank again all the speakers, but also all of you, because I see that there's still many people present in the room. So very, very big thank you for everyone in the audience for your time today. It's been a privilege to welcome you all. Thank you. See you soon, and bye-bye.